related into the next generation. But if people colonize everything, which I'm hoping will happen, and I expect to happen, then most things that happen in space-time are caused by people. Now, our educational system is still very archaic, and it's based on what Popper called the
इंट्रो देगा ना अभी
हम्म बढ़ाते
bucket
हैं
theory
आगे.
of the mind, which is that the mind is a kind of bucket for knowledge, and boring.
वैसे ही वो बिल्ड कर रहा है.
It's a
अच्छा.
pleasure. So we never get that.
David, thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. So where are we going?
You have quite a tragic view of human history, and can you explain that view and talk about why you see human history as a long period of complete failure?
I think it's unanswerable that that's what it was. We know that our species, like anatomically, originated about 300,000 years ago. Maybe there were some tweaks, and it's only 200,000, but around about that time. And throughout that time, we know that our ancestors were capable of creative thought because they created things like campfires. And making a campfire involves putting together several things that you have to plan in advance, and you have to do things which you do in order to do the next thing, in order to do the next thing. Like you have to make a space for the fire so that the kindling won't be blown away. Then you have to get the kindling, and what's it called? I'm not a campfire person, but there's kindling, and then there's a second thing. What?
No, the spark.
अभी वो
सही
इतने
बात
innocence के साथ
है.
बोल रहा है भाई सब कुछ
वो तो
No, the
स्पार्क
spark is
ऐड
a
कर रहा
different thing.
है. मुझे लगा चैप्टर की बात कर रहा है. वो कहता है ना द स्पार्क. तो डेविड को लगता है मुझे वो वाले स्पार्क की बात कर रहा है, लेकिन वो अर्जुन वो स्पार्क जो क्रिएट करती है फायर उसकी बात कर रहा है. लेकिन डेविड को लगा कि वो चैप्टर है थर्ड, उसकी बात कर रहा है स्पार्क जिससे सब स्टार्ट हुआ है बिग इन्फिनिटी. तो वही.
apps हो गए इन दोनों के
अभी बात करेंगे कम्युनिकेशन खुद ही ये लोग वही
Yeah,
फिर से
you have
स्टार्ट.
to know how to make a spark as well. Or you could wait till the next lightning strike on a tree and get a branch, but that may be how they first realized that there was such a thing as fire. But if you want to make fire intentionally and use it, you can't just make fire. It's got to be burning there for a long time. Anyway, they did that, and it spread around the world. And then
1.2 पे देखते हैं
0.25 पे देखते हैं.
you can tell, if paleontologists find the remains of a campsite from a couple of 100,000 years ago, they can't date it from the style of the stone tools and so on to better than a few thousand years, if that. So that means that on a timescale of 2,000 years, nothing noticeable was invented. We can tell from the fact that there was a campfire that there were sophisticated people there, as sophisticated as us. Now that's already quite a tragic fact, because their lives were extremely unpleasant, and also their population increased very slowly. So why doesn't the population increase fast? Well, famine, climate, predators, exhaustion of the environment and or other people. So their lives were very grim, so unimaginably grim by our standards. And then when civilization began, which people kind of date to settlements, villages, and so on, the rate of progress increased slightly. So when you see some pottery, the experts can say, oh yeah, that's late Bronze Age or something like that. But that's still a very low resolution. Now, if you see an iPhone, you can say, well, not late Bronze Age, that's late 2022. So things are changing faster and faster, and all the things that change are things that people at least think is better than the previous version. So people don't work to get the next version usually if
बहुत इंक्रीज कर रही है और बहुत टाइम सिविलाइजेशन मतलब एक्सपोनेंशियली इसी जिसके अंदर ऐसे वो बताता है कि अगर पूरे ह्यूमन एग्जिस्टेंस को मतलब क्लॉक
हाँ, पॉइंट बहुत
बहुत
कुछ
बहुत
सेकंड्स पे,
हाँ
सेकंड
बहुत अच्छे थे वो आखिरी के 1-2 मिनट में ही हुए हैं ऐसा
हाँ, कुछ सेकंड्स में हुए हैं। अगर पूरे यूनिवर्स का टाइम में दिखाएंगे, हाँ, तो यही बात हो रही है, मतलब वो क्रिटिक जो प्रोग्रेस हो रहा है, जो बेटर देन द प्रीवियस वन है, तो मुझे लग रहा है वो क्रिटिसिज्म की ही बात कर रहा है, जो ये अपनी बुक में बताते हैं कि क्रिटिसिज्म के थ्रू प्रोग्रेस होता है बेटर देन द प्रीवियस वन। मुझे लग रहा है वो अभी जैसे वो आईफोन निकाल के बता रहे थे कि अभी की बात हो रही है, तो मतलब धीरे धीरे ये बेटर हो रहा है, टेक बेटर हो रहा है, तो वो बेटरमेंट कैसे हो रहा है, तो अभी तक मुझे लग रहा है इसी की बात हो रही है, अभी तक तो कोई
they have the
खास नहीं
previous
है। अभी डेप्थ होगी आगे।
version. So the change, the important change, sort of historically, I think, is the moment when a typical person could notice that lifestyles were changing during their lifetime. So when you know that you're living differently from your parents and they were living differently from their grandparents, that is a completely novel thing to happen to the human species. For most of those hundreds of thousands of years, that didn't happen. People didn't even have a conception of that something could improve. Except occasionally when somebody invented a better technique for making the campfire or something, realized that you have to stack the wood. It's better if you stack the wood one way than another. But that was very, very rare. If that had happened on a noticeable timescale, then there would have been exponential improvement, and we would have had civilization within a few generations. And so you say I have a grim view of the past. Well, it depends how you look at it. If you look at it backwards in time, it gets grimmer and grimmer. If you look at it forwards in time, it's first incredibly frustrating for hundreds of thousands of years, and then it's the opposite of grim. It's hopeful, and that's where we are now.
Why do you think that changed with the Enlightenment?
It is a puzzle that I thought about a lot. How it is possible that
अभी ये वाले पीरियड की बात कर रहे हैं ना जो अभी आया था 200 साल के
हाँ, वो रेनेसा वाली पीरियड जो यूरोप में आया था, रेनेसा, जहाँ से क्वेश्चन स्टार्ट किया, अथॉरिटी को क्वेश्चन करना इन लोगों ने। पहले रिलीजियस, हाँ, स्क्रिप्चर्स पर रिलाय करते थे उससे पहले, जो चर्च ने बोल दिया वही फाइनल है, और हेरेसी मानते थे किसी भी चीज को, मतलब अगर जो क्वेश्चन करता है, जैसे गैलीलियो से स्टार्ट होता है कि अर्थ राउंड है, और कोपरनिकस भी था जो कहता है कि क्या, कि अर्थ चक्कर लगाता है सन के अराउंड, तो फिर उनको पकड़ के कर दिया जाता था उनके साथ कुछ ना कुछ। इसीलिए इसीलिए भाई डरते थे ना।
कर रहे हैं शायद
एनलाइटनमेंट के बाद से प्रोग्रेस बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ गई है ना, तभी तो यूरोप का इतना कंट्रोल था हर जगह, क्योंकि उन्होंने सबसे पहले ही ये किया था, उन्होंने तभी तो इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन आया है, तभी सब कुछ आया है, वहीं से प्रोग्रेस जो बाहर की प्रोग्रेस है वो बहुत स्टार्ट हुई, मटेरियल वर्ल्ड की प्रोग्रेस बहुत ज्यादा स्टार्ट हुई है, तो ये बात है एकदम।
creatures, apes, humans, with our cognitive capacity. But I couldn't invent a campfire if I didn't know in advance. I'm not that kind of person. It takes some kind of genius to do that. So those people were intellectually our equals, and yet made no progress. So the question is, if they were intellectually our equals, that means that faculty of mind must have evolved. There's nothing else that can create that kind of knowledge apart from biological evolution. So they must have evolved to have that capacity. And then from our perspective, they simply didn't use it. Now, I think that's impossible because it couldn't have evolved unless they were using it during the whole time that it evolved. Because there must have been, a selective advantage for the people that had slightly more of whatever it was, to build up from whatever it was to what we have now and what they had hundreds of thousands of years ago. So what were they using it for? And I think it's I can't think of any other possible way this could have happened than that they used it for replicating memes. So memes are bits of culture, patterns of behavior, like making a campfire in a particular way.
जो जो प्रॉपर्टीज थी
वो तो है ही है, जो बिहेवियर है, कल्चर ट्रांसफर हुआ है एक जगह से दूसरी जगह।
तक
मतलब जब कैंप
कर रहे हैं ना कि एनलाइटनमेंट तक क्यों मतलब इतना टाइम लगा एनलाइटनमेंट मतलब वो रीच करने में स्टेज, जबकि ह्यूमन का जो मतलब जो अंडरस्टैंडिंग
इंटेलेक्चुअल
था
लेवल
वो
तक सेम था, अभी से इक्वली था, लेकिन वो प्रोग्रेस उस लेवल पे नहीं हो पा रही थी जो चाहिए थी। और जैसे कि बोल रहा है, जब सबसे अच्छी मतलब मुझे अभी वो लगा कि जो कैंप फायर है, उसको अगर जैसे भी कोई भी फायर है, उसको अगर बनाने में एक जीनियस ही लगता है, क्योंकि अचानक से कहीं से भी आ जा रही फायर, उस टाइम पे क्रिएट करना मतलब जीनियस ही समझ लो। फायर कैसे कोई क्रिएट कर सकता है, कितना रैंडम होगा सोचो। ये कितनी डेप्थ है, मतलब क्रिएटिविटी चाहिए अच्छी खासी। इंटेलेक्चुअल की बात ही नहीं हो रही यहाँ पे, क्रिएटिविटी की बात हो रही है, मुझे ऐसा लगता है, क्रिएशन की
Or
बात हो रही
speaking
है।
in a particular language. By the way, language also evolved and must have been used while it was evolving. People sometimes forget that. It must have been used before it was at our level. So they must have had some way of storing that cultural information. But cultural information, unlike genetic information, cannot be just mechanically transferred. In our cells, in every cell, there is all the genetic information that we have, and to copy that into the offspring is an automatic process. It doesn't require any kind of information processing other than copying. But memes, information, culture, is not like that. There's no way of copying information from one mind to another. And here is where Popper's epistemology comes in, because Popper realized that there is no such thing as copying by instruction either. Our educational system is still very archaic, and it's based on what Popper called the bucket.
कार्ल पॉपर की एपिस्टेमोलॉजी, वो मीम कैसे ट्रांसफर होना वो स्टार्ट हुआ है। एंड उसका तो मेन काम इंडक्शन पे था, पॉपर का। मतलब कि साइंस की ज्यादा जरूरत है फॉल्सिफिकेशन में, ना कि किसी थ्योरी को प्रूव करने के लिए। पहले साइंटिस्ट ये समझ रहे थे कि हम पहले कोई थ्योरी देंगे फिर उसको प्रूव करने में लग जाएंगे, लेकिन नहीं, पॉपर कहता है कि अगर असली कोई थ्योरी है तो उसको अगर हम फॉल्सिफाई कर रहे हैं तभी सही है। मतलब थ्योरी धीरे धीरे बढ़ती जाएगा, तभी इंक्रीमेंट आएगा। थ्योरी कोई एब्सोल्यूट नहीं है कि हम एकदम ट्रुथ के एकदम हो जाएंगे। पहले ऐसा हो रहा था कि साइंस ऐसा सोच रहा था कि कोई एक थ्योरी आ गई, अब बस उसको प्रूव करना है एक्सपेरिमेंट के थ्रू। नहीं, ऐसा कुछ नहीं है। उसको बेटर करना है, उसे फॉल्सिफाई करने की जितनी हो सके उतनी कोशिश करनी है, तभी प्रोग्रेस होगा। जितना तुम जल्दी फॉल्सिफाई करोगे उतना जल्दी। जैसे न्यूटन का पहले आया तो ग्रेविटी में, जैसे वो अरे स्पेस टाइम, फिर रिलेटिविटी आया तो थोड़ा सा डिफरेंस है उस थ्योरी में, क्योंकि वो कहीं ना कहीं गलत हो रही थी किसी चीज में, ग्रेविटी। फिर ऐसे ही अभी तो रिलेटिविटी है करेंटली, तो ऐसे ही प्रोग्रेस, मतलब थ्योरी को फॉल्सिफाई करना है हमें, क्वेश्चन करना है, क्रिटिसाइज करना है। तो पॉपर का यही है, और ना कि उसे प्रूव करना है किसी तरीके से कि एक एब्सोल्यूट थ्योरी है।
Theory of the mind.
जैसा हाँ मीम्स की बात
mind, which is that the mind is a
परसेप्शन ही कुछ और होता है वो
हाँ ये
मीम्स का एक्चुअली ओरिजिन
हाँ
तो कुछ और ही था
ये बहुत सही है कि मीम्स ये तो हम ये अपनी क्रिएटिविटी से है और जो जीन्स है वो ऑटोमेटिक रिप्रोडक्शन के थ्रू ट्रांसफर हो रहा है वो बॉडी खुद कर रही है दूसरे से एक बॉडी से जब रिप्रोडक्शन हो रहा है चाहे जितने एनिमल्स हो चाहे स्पीशीज हो चाहे ह्यूमंस हो वो जीन्स तो अपने आप ही ट्रांसफर हो रही है दो तरीके के माने ना इन्होंने एक तो वो रिचर्ड डॉकिंस का है मीम्स जीन्स के थ्रू और ये कल्चर और बिहेवियर वाला मीम्स है ये तो हम ट्रांसफर करते हैं क्योंकि हम किसी को कुछ सिखाते हैं अगर कैंप फायर किसी को हम सिखा रहे हैं फायर किसी को भी सिखा रहे हैं तो एक तरीके का मीम ट्रांसफर वो सोशल बिहेवियर हुआ कुछ भी हुआ तो मुझे लग रहा है उसी की बात कर रहे हैं अभी तो
kind of bucket for knowledge, and that education or upbringing consists of pouring some of this knowledge from the earlier generation into the next generation. But that's not possible. It can only come by conjecture and criticism, according to Popper, and he's, I think, obviously right once you get it. So it comes from within. It comes from conjecture from the recipient, not from the intentions of the transmitter of the cultural information. So that means, but you can't translate a piece of culture faithfully just by copying it. So if I see, let's say, a tennis player, playing, I can try and copy him in an ape-like way, and I'll be rubbish at playing. And so how is it that the coach can then get me to? Well, it's not by saying, well, hit it just before the top of the bounce or whatever. It's by me guessing what the coach means, and the coach guessing what I'm not getting. And so between us, we can arrange for me to learn how to play tennis well, and that will only work if I want to play tennis well. So I might want something else. And so this creative capacity must have been used for transmitting memes, or for receiving memes more precisely, and it wasn't used for anything else. Why wasn't it used for anything else? Because in the theory of evolution, we know that things only ever evolved towards greater fidelity. Some people think that that there's an optimum level of error correction in the DNA mechanism, because if you correct too much, it won't evolve at all, and if you correct too little, then you might be killed, and so on. But that's not true.
की बात कर रहे हैं ना कि मतलब बहुत रैपिडली चेंज होता है जब कोई चीज हाई फिडेलिटी होती है तो हमारी कैपेसिटी क्रिएटिविटी वाली बहुत टाइम तक मीम्स को बस रेप्लिकेट करने में यूज हो गया ऐसा
ट्रांसफर उसे क्वेश्चन करने में नहीं उसको जैसे तैसे ट्रांसफर करने में लग गया
में हम लोगों ने क्वेश्चन किया हम लोगों ने कंजेक्चर किया तो उससे फिडिलिटी
हाँ
बढ़ गई है ऐसे और बहुत रैपिडली हम लोग ऐसे फॉल्सिफाई कर रहे हैं जो कि सही है जो गलत है
प्रोग्रेस के थ्रू फॉल्सिफाई कर रहे हैं फिर ही प्रोग्रेस कर रहे हैं पहले तो जो सिखाया जा रहा था उसी को हम फॉलो कर रहे थे जो भी मिमेटिक हमें बिहेवियर था वो जो ट्रांसफर हो रहा था उसी को फॉलो कर रहे थे और उससे ज्यादा कुछ कर नहीं रहे थे मुझे लगता है
In the theory
इसलिए
of
भी अभी जितनी बात हुई
evolution, we know that things only ever evolved towards greater fidelity. Some people think that that there's an optimum level of error correction in the DNA mechanism, because if you correct too much, it won't evolve at all, and if you correct too little, then you might be killed, and so on. But that's not true. Biological evolution only ever evolves in the direction of greater fidelity, and the fact that there is any mutation left is not evolution's fault. It's just how the physics of the thing works out.
Can you explain the term fallibilism, and how does it differ from relativism and dogmatism?
Chalk and cheese, or polar opposites, really. So fallibilism is the idea that we're not infallible. Now, everybody knows that they're not infallible about some things. Everybody knows that they don't know in detail how a TV works, or how a crop of corn is sown, and so on. Everybody knows that they're ignorant and have misconceptions about some things. But they think there are some things you can be absolutely sure of. Religious people think they can be, some religious people think they can be absolutely sure of their religion. Some people have transferred that idea to science, which is sometimes lampooned as science with a capital S, science, which is a mistake, because science is a process of discovery, of critical examination of existing ideas and finding problems within them and solving them with new theories. So our best theories at one time are not the same as our best theories at a later time. So it's simply wrong to think of the world as scientists being infallible. Then some people think, oh well, at least 2 + 2 is 4. That's
पॉज करो.
we can't be wrong about that. Well,
ये मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा जब ये नहीं कह रहे हैं कि साइंटिस्ट भी फैलेबल हो सकते हैं, कि कोई साइंटिस्ट इनफैलिबल नहीं है, मतलब प्रोन टू एरर है साइंटिस्ट भी. तो क्योंकि बहुत लोग अब तो ये लोग समझ गए हैं कि रिलीजन को लोग काफी लोग क्वेश्चन करते हैं कि हाँ ये गलत होगा, ये ऐसा नहीं होगा, लेकिन कभी कभी ये मान लेते हैं कि साइंस से ऊपर कुछ नहीं है, कैपिटल एस वाला साइंस की मतलब इसे. लेकिन ऐसा कुछ नहीं है, साइंस भी ऐसे ही प्रोग्रेस करता है कि वो मिस्टेक करता है, तो वो प्रोन टू एरर है. इनफैलिबल नहीं है साइंस, तो ये एक्सेप्ट करना ही प्रोग्रेस का वो है. तो ये बहुत मतलब इतनी ह्यूमिलिटी है डेविड के अंदर, ये इस बात को एक्सेप्ट करने की. मतलब साइंटिस्ट अक्सर बदतमीज होते हैं. अब रिचर्ड डॉकिंस को ही देख लो, ऐसा लगता है कि मतलब एब्सोल्यूट ट्रुथ उसी के हाथ में है. ये मुझे लगता है ह्यूमिलिटी है कारण है प्रोग्रेस का, और इतना समझ को डेवलप करना डेविड जैसे, ये एक्सेप्ट करना ही तो बहुत
है. जो साइंटिस्ट मतलब भी फैलेबल है, इतने
वही है.
कर दे, बट स्टिल लाइक
वो भी
उसके कंजेक्चर से कुछ थ्योरीज रॉन्ग हो सकते हैं, और जो होता भी है,
वही
मतलब सारे
प्रोन टू
थ्योरीज
एरर.
एक एक करके वही.
वही तभी
it
सही.
depends what you mean by that. Suppose you're a primary school pupil and you get an exam and it says 2 + 2 equals, and you write there 2 + 2. 2 + 2 equals 2 + 2. That's going to be wrong. It's true, but it's the wrong answer to the question. So it's not entirely true that 2 + 2 is 4. If you had said 3 + 1, or it depends on the context. You might have just learned that 2 + 2 is 2 times 2, which is an extremely interesting fact. But it's also true and interesting, but it's still not the answer. So what I'm trying to say rather laboriously is that language is inherently imprecise and context dependent. And when we say that we know for sure that something is the case, we can never, we're trying to grasp an abstract thing, something about the integers, something about numbers, something about the operation of addition. So somebody might say, no, you can still be certain about 2 + 2 is 4 because
बीच में
कुछ कर दिया होगा भाई.
होगा बात करते करते, तो बीच में
लेकिन ये बहुत सही था कि लैंग्वेज इम्प्रेसाइज हो सकती है, लैंग्वेज का एरर हो सकता है. तो हम ये इधर तो इन्होंने लैंग्वेज पे भी क्वेश्चन किया और मैथ पे भी क्वेश्चन किया है. तो मतलब इतना डेप्थ में जाना, हर एक चीज पकड़ना, तो बहुत कम ही लोग करते हैं. तो मुझे बहुत सही लग रहा है कि ये लैंग्वेज इम्प्रेसाइज हो सकती है, तो गड़बड़ हो सकती है किसी भी चीज में से एक्सेप्ट करना है. तो देखो आगे.
so somebody might say, no, you can still be certain
एक सेकंड रुकना.
about 2 + 2 is 4 because you're just expressing it in a certain language. And if you say 2 + 2 is 3 + 1, that is true, but it's not the right answer expressed in the language of the culture in which you're in, and that's an objective fact. But if you were an ancient Roman and you wrote that 4 is 3 + 1, 3 strokes, and then 1 stroke, it would be right. Or 2 strokes plus 2 strokes, it would still be right. So, then you might say, wait a minute, 4 is 1V. No, it isn't. The ancient Romans had 1, 1, 1, 1 for 4. The 1V is a later invention. And there will have been a time when both things were used and when it was ambiguous. And both things are used today even. If you look at a clock face that's got Roman numerals, they still, for some reason, use 1, 1, 1, 1 rather than 1V. The way I like to think of this is that there are absolute truths in the abstract world, which we approximate with language. We approximate this by saying certain utterances, 2 plus 2 is 4, and so on. And those utterances are subject to error. The Americans had a Mars probe a while ago, and it crashed because some of the engineers were using metric units and some were using imperial units. So you can't be absolutely certain of anything. This has implications not just for mathematics and for speaking and so on. It has very
मतलब यही कह रहे हैं ना कि मतलब एरर कितना कोई भी थ्योरी दे उसमें एरर रहेगा ही रहेगा क्यों
सर्टेन नहीं है मैथमेटिक्स लोग बहुत मानते हैं कि एब्सोल्यूट ट्रूथ है नहीं है ऐसा कुछ नहीं है ये डेविड ऐसे कह रहे हैं कि सर्टेन नहीं है अभी कुछ भी एब्स्ट्रैक्ट एंटिटी है और क्योंकि लैंग्वेज ही वो हो सकती है तो कुछ भी गलत हो सकता है तो बहुत ही यहाँ पे डेप्थ है समझ में
important implications for things like politics because if some political idea if you thought you knew some political idea with certainty, then that would change the morality of politics. It would make it immoral for somebody to try and thwart you, because you are right, and you are infallibly right. And this idea has indeed killed people in many cultures. But then people say, well, if nothing is certain, how can we ever know anything? And then you have to realize that all our knowledge is conjectural.
ऐसे मोमेंट पे किसी को भी क्राइसिस आ जाए भाई कि मतलब कुछ भी सर्टेन नहीं है जैसे हम लोग कितने सारे कॉन्सेप्ट बना के चलते हैं माइंड में कि अच्छा ये चीज़ ये थ्योरीज रहती है हमारी थ्योरीज तो हमेशा रहती हैं देखा जाए तो कि ये चीज़ एग्जिस्ट ऐसे करती है वैसे करती है हमारे ऑलरेडी थ्योरीज होती हैं लेकिन मतलब अगर पता चले कि कुछ भी फॉर सर्टेन नहीं है और जो हमारे थ्योरीज है वो भी काफ़ी फैलेबल है उनमें भी एरर्स हैं तो मतलब एक बहुत ही बड़ा क्राइसिस आ सकता है किसी को भी सोच के और आता भी है
वो तो है मैं क्राइसिस की बात मुझे लग रहा है कि समझ आनी चाहिए कि चीजें चेंज होती रहती हैं उसके अकॉर्डिंग चेंज होना पड़ता है जैसे अभी बोल रहे थे पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी है कोई उसको लोग पकड़ के बैठ जाते हैं जैसे कम्युनिज्म को लोग पकड़ के बैठ जाते हैं तो उसकी वजह से कितने लोगों की जाने नहीं है क्योंकि वो एब्सोल्यूट मान लेते हैं कि इसके आगे कुछ नहीं है कोई भी बुक को मान लेते हैं कोई भी कुछ भी हो और कोई भी रिलीजियस बुक हो तो उससे अगर हम एब्सोल्यूट सर्टेन मान रहे हैं तो वो प्रॉब्लम है वो इनफैलिबल नहीं है फैलिबल है क्योंकि कुछ भी सर्टेन नहीं है क्या आगे क्रिएट होगा क्या वो होगा कुछ नहीं पता तो ये बहुत लर्निंग है कि कुछ भी पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी कोई एब्सोल्यूट नहीं है जब साइंटिफिक थ्योरी एब्सोल्यूट नहीं है तो पॉलिटिकल थ्योरी कहाँ से एब्सोल्यूट हो जाएगी यही
आई थिंक वही मतलब ये कि कह रहा है एरर तो हर थ्योरी में रहेगा बट जो चीज़ हम लोग को बहुत स्ट्रांगली होल्ड करना है वो एरर करेक्शन वाली चीज़ें जो है जो भी चीज़ें एरर करेक्शन में यूज़ होती है जो भी थ्योरीज क्रिएट करने में जो मैकेनिज्म है उसको सॉलिडिफाई करना बहुत ज़रूरी है कि कैसे थ्योरीज क्रिएट हो रहे हैं
all the information, the knowledge, the words and sentences in science they all have the form of either conjectures, where you're saying maybe it's so and so. Even if you don't say maybe, you mean maybe, or criticism, conjectures or criticism. So that can't be right because so and so, or can that be right because this other thing, and so on. And that's how science progresses. And although we can never know in the sense of certainty that we're right about something, we can know that we don't have any further criticisms of it. So in that case, we use it. So I think that the ground isn't going to open up and swallow us, just because there's been a bit of rain recently. And I don't know that for sure. I mean, there are people who've been swallowed up in sinkholes when they were least expecting it. But the idea that there is a sinkhole here which is going to swallow us up fails the most elementary criticism. So I can reject that. It's rational to reject it. And being rational doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to be right because of fallibilism again. But it is the way to improve our knowledge. It's the way to correct errors. So if we have an idea that is false, and we then find a flaw, and we find a better idea, we are better off objectively. We just don't know for sure that that is so.
Can you give an example or two of how cultural relativism has severely impeded progress, or at least destroyed significant human capital?
Right. Well, where do I begin? So at the moment, there's a wave of cultural relativism, which is part of what they call woke and that kind of thing, which demonizes claiming that one culture is better than another. Now, this means, so among other things, this means that there's no such thing as improvement, because if we are to improve our existing culture, and by culture I mean everything we know or think we know, if we want to improve that, we're hoping that we will reach a state which is better than the previous state. So the state, like next year, will be better than the state now, so the next year we could say our culture before was worse than our culture now. And cultural relativism, and the same holds for moral relativism, would forbid saying that. And the same thing is true about different cultures, not the same culture at different times, but different cultures at the same time. So if our culture improved, if I thought of improvement to our culture now, and I hadn't told anybody yet, then our culture would be better here at this spot where I am, and less good elsewhere. And if this spread to the whole country, then the whole country's culture would be, assuming that the whole culture of the world was homogeneous and equal, then as soon as there was any improvement, it would happen somewhere, and that somewhere would have a better culture. And again, if we're forbidden from saying that or thinking it, then we're forbidden from making that improvement as well, because the converse of saying that it won't be better is saying that you're not only are you wrong factually that this would be a better piece of culture, but you're wrong morally, because you're trying to change the culture which is already the best it could be. Now, I suppose that you might say that sounds a bit theoretical, but this is happening in real life all the time. I'm thinking of, for example, Richard Dawkins got very irate a couple of years ago when he went to New Zealand, and New Zealand was about to implement indigenous ways of knowing into the school curriculum. And this is indigenous ways of knowing physics, for example, among other things. So Richard Dawkins was saying, no, there's only one way of knowing physics. He didn't say, and that way is fallible, which I think might have helped.